The scream woke me up at 3 in the morning. I live in Salem, Massachusetts, in one of those old apartment buildings where you can hear everything through the walls. Usually it's just footsteps or muffled TV shows, but this was different. This scream came from the apartment next door, and it didn't sound right. I can't really explain it properly, but after working as a homicide detective for 8 years, you get used to hearing screams. Angry screams, scared screams, pain screams. This one was none of those. It sounded like someone was trying to scream, but their voice was breaking apart halfway through, like static on a bad radio signal. I jumped out of bed, grabbed my gun from the nightstand, and ran into the hallway in my pajamas. My neighbor's door was locked, so I kicked it in. The wood around the handle splintered easily, because these old buildings have cheap locks. I burst inside with my gun raised, ready for whatever I was going to find. But the apartment was completely quiet. No intruder, no struggle, nothing, just silence. My neighbor was sitting in her rocking chair by the window. She was this sweet old lady who always said good morning when we passed each other in the hallway. She'd bring me cookies sometimes, those butter ones with the sugar on top. The newspaper was folded on her lap, and her reading glasses hung from that beaded chain she always wore around her neck. For a second, I thought maybe she'd just fallen asleep in her chair. People do that sometimes. But then I got closer and saw her face. Her mouth was open. Not just open like yawning, but stretched wider than I thought a human mouth could go. I could see all her teeth, even the ones in the very back of her jaw. Her eyes were huge, bulging out like something had grabbed them from behind and pushed them forward. She was staring straight ahead at nothing, or maybe at something I couldn't see. The expression on her face was pure terror, the kind that makes your chest tight just looking at it. I've seen dead bodies before, plenty of them, but I'd never seen anything like this. She looked like she'd died mid-scream, like someone had pressed pause on the scariest moment of her entire life. I checked her pulse anyway, even though I knew she was gone. Her skin was cold. I looked around the apartment for any sign of what happened. The windows were closed and locked from the inside. The door had been locked too until I broke it down. There were no signs of a fight, no knocked-over furniture, no threatening notes. Nothing that would explain why a healthy 70-year-old woman would suddenly die of fear in her own home. That's when I noticed the music box on the floor next to her feet. It was one of those old jewelry boxes with a ballerina inside that spins when you wind it up. The paint was chipped and faded, and the little metal key on the side was rusty and tarnished. I'd been living next door to this woman for 3 years, and I'd never seen that music box before. I'd been in her apartment a few times when she needed help changing a light bulb or moving furniture, and I was pretty sure I would have remembered something like that. There was something off about it, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't touch it. I just stared at it, wondering where it came from. My phone rang, making me jump. It was Officer Ramirez from the station. His voice was tense. "We've got a situation. A postal worker found dead in his truck. No obvious cause, but you need to see his face. I've never seen anything like it." A cold dread washed over me. What about his face? It's stuck in a scream. His eyes are bulging. It's not right. I looked down at the body of my neighbor, at her own frozen scream. The connection clicked into place with horrifying certainty. I told him I'd be there in 15 minutes. I threw on some clothes and drove across town to where they'd found the second body. It was still dark out, and the streets were empty except for a few streetlights. The address Ramirez gave me was in a residential neighborhood on the north side. When I got there, there were already 2 police cars parked with their lights flashing. A mail truck was stopped in the middle of the street with its driver's side door hanging open. The victim was a postal worker, slumped over the steering wheel. I'd seen him around before, delivering mail in my neighborhood. He always wore the same blue uniform and always had headphones in, listening to music while he worked. Now he was dead, and his face looked exactly like my neighbor's face. That same impossible scream frozen in place, that same bulging-eyed stare at something invisible. His hands were gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles were white. The medical examiner was already there, a woman named Dr. Patterson who I'd worked with on a dozen cases. She looked frustrated, which wasn't normal for her. She's usually calm and professional, but right now she kept shaking her head and muttering to herself. I asked her what killed him, and she said his heart stopped. Just stopped, like someone flipped a switch. She said it looked like cardiac arrest caused by extreme stress or fear, but there was nothing in the truck that would cause that kind of reaction. No weapon, no threatening messages, nothing. Except there was something. Sitting on the passenger seat, placed carefully like someone had set it there on purpose, was an old Polaroid camera, the kind from the 1970s with the square photos that develop right in front of you. It looked old and used, with scratches all over the plastic and dust on the lens. I took pictures of the camera with my phone, but told everyone not to touch it until we could bag it as evidence. Something about it felt wrong, the same way the music box had felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but looking at that camera made my stomach turn. Dr. Patterson kept examining the body, checking for needle marks or any sign of drugs, but she wasn't finding anything. The guy had just died. His heart had stopped because he was scared, but scared of what? There was nothing in that truck except mail and packages and that old camera that shouldn't have been there. By the time I got back to the police station, the sun was starting to come up. My captain, a stern woman named Rodriguez who'd been running the homicide division for 15 years, was waiting in my office. She closed the door behind her, which meant this conversation wasn't going to be fun. She wanted to know what the hell was going on. 2 people dead in the same night, both with the same expression of terror on their faces, both with no clear cause of death. The mayor's office was already calling, the press was camped outside the station, and everyone wanted answers I didn't have. I showed her the photos on my phone, the music box, and the camera. I told her they were at both crime scenes, just sitting there like someone had placed them. She asked if I thought we were dealing with a serial killer, someone who was somehow scaring people to death and leaving these objects as a signature. I said maybe, but honestly, I didn't know. The whole thing felt off. How do you scare someone so badly their heart stops? And why leave old junk from the 70s at the scene? It didn't make sense. Rodriguez told me to go home and get some rest. I looked like hell, she said, and she wasn't wrong. I'd been up all night and my hands were shaking from too much adrenaline and not enough sleep. But when I got home, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those faces, about that frozen scream, so instead of sleeping, I made coffee and pulled out my laptop. I uploaded all the crime scene photos and started going through them one by one, zooming in on every detail, looking for anything I might have missed. That's when I saw it. In one of the photos from my neighbor's apartment, in the corner near the window, there was something on the floor. I zoomed in until the image got grainy and pixelated. It was a circle, scratched into the hardwood floor, not drawn with marker or chalk, but actually carved into the wood itself. And inside that circle were symbols, strange twisted letters that didn't look like any alphabet I recognized. They were uneven and shaky, like someone had scratched them there in a panic. I zoomed in more and looked at my neighbor's hands in another photo. Her fingernails were broken and bloody. She'd carved those symbols herself, probably right before she died. But why? What did they mean? I copied the symbols onto a piece of paper, drawing them as carefully as I could. They looked almost like writing, but wrong somehow, like someone had taken normal letters and bent them into shapes that hurt to look at. My phone buzzed. Another text from Ramirez. 3rd body found. High school on the east side. I need you here now. I grabbed my jacket and drove across town, running red lights because the streets were still mostly empty. The high school was one of those old brick buildings from the 1920s, with tall windows and a bell tower that didn't work anymore. There were already 3 police cars in the parking lot when I arrived. Ramirez met me at the entrance. He looked pale, and his hands were shaking when he handed me the visitor badge. He told me the janitor had heard screaming coming from one of the classrooms on the 2nd floor. He'd run to check it out, but the door was locked from the inside. The screaming went on and on, he said, for at least 5 minutes straight. 5 minutes of non-stop screaming. By the time the janitor got the door unlocked with his master key, the teacher was already dead. We walked through the empty hallways, our footsteps echoing off the lockers. It was strange being in a school when there were no students around. Everything felt too quiet, too still. The classroom was at the end of the hall, the door propped open with a chair. I could smell something metallic in the air before we even got close, that sharp iron smell that makes your nose wrinkle. The classroom was an art room. There were easels and paint supplies everywhere, half-finished student projects hanging on the walls. And in the middle of the room, lying on the floor, was the teacher. She was maybe 30 years old, wearing a paint-stained apron over her clothes. Her face had that same expression, that same impossible scream, those same bulging eyes. But this time, there was more. She'd used red paint to draw a circle around herself on the floor. A big circle, maybe 6 feet across, with her body right in the center. And all over the walls, painted in that same red paint, were those symbols. The same twisted letters I'd seen carved into my neighbor's floor. But here they were everywhere, covering the walls in frantic strokes, dripping down like blood. Some of the symbols were painted so hard the paint had splattered. She must have been terrified, painting these things as fast as she could, trying to protect herself from something. Next to her body was a wooden spinning top, the kind kids play with. It was old and worn, with faded paint that might have been bright colors once. Just like the music box and the camera, it looked like it came from decades ago. I knelt down next to the circle, careful not to step inside it. Ramirez asked me what I thought it meant, and I told him I didn't know. But that was a lie. I was starting to have an idea, and it was an idea I didn't want to believe. Because if I was right, then we weren't dealing with a serial killer at all. We were dealing with something else entirely. I took photos of everything. The circle, the symbols, the spinning top, all of it. Then I told Ramirez to seal off the room and not let anyone touch anything until the crime scene techs arrived. He asked me where I was going, and I told him I needed to check something at the station. What I really needed was to get away from that classroom, away from those symbols dripping down the walls like warnings I couldn't understand. Back at the station, I went straight to the basement. We keep all the old case files down there, boxes and boxes of them going back decades. The basement smells like mold and old paper, and the fluorescent lights flicker constantly, but nobody ever complains, because nobody ever goes down there except to store more boxes. I started pulling files from the shelves, looking for anything from the 70s. My hands were shaking as I searched, and I kept telling myself I was crazy, that I was sleep-deprived and seeing connections that weren't there. But then I found it. A box labeled Salem Deaths 1978, Unsolved. Inside were dozens of reports, all describing the same thing. People dying with no clear cause, just pure terror frozen on their faces. 23 deaths over 3 months, and then nothing. The deaths just stopped. I pulled out the reports one by one, spreading them across the dusty floor. Every single report mentioned those same expressions of fear. Every single victim had died of cardiac arrest with no obvious trigger. And in several of the crime scene photos I could see those objects. A rotary phone, a transistor radio, a pocket watch. All old, all from the 70s, all sitting next to the bodies like they'd been placed there deliberately. My chest felt tight as I flipped through more photos. In 3 of them, I could see symbols scratched into surfaces. The same symbols I'd seen today. The same twisted letters that made my eyes hurt to look at. These people back in 1978 had known something was coming for them. They'd tried to protect themselves with these circles and symbols, and it hadn't worked. The lead investigator on the case was Detective James Calhoun. I recognized the name immediately. He was my grandfather. He died when I was 10 years old, supposedly of a heart attack while watching television. But my grandmother had always said there was something wrong about his death, something she couldn't explain. She said he'd been working on a case that changed him, made him paranoid and jumpy. He'd stopped sleeping, stopped eating, and then one day his heart just stopped. I kept digging through the box until I found a folded piece of notebook paper tucked into the very bottom underneath all the reports. The paper was yellowed with age, and the handwriting on it was shaky and rushed. I recognized my grandfather's handwriting immediately, because I still had birthday cards he'd sent me as a kid. This note was dated October 15th, 1978, about 2 weeks before the death stopped. The note said, "If anyone finds this, I've gone to the old textile mill on Parker Street. I think I know where it hides during the day. I don't know if I'll make it back. If I don't, burn everything. Burn the objects it leaves behind. Don't touch them and don't let anyone else touch them. And whatever happens, don't let it feed." Below that, he'd written one more line that made my blood run cold. "Its name is Jurapari, and it's been hunting in this city longer than any of us have been alive." I sat there on the basement floor, holding that note in my trembling hands. My grandfather had been investigating the same thing I was investigating now. He'd figured something out, something important enough to risk his life. And then he'd disappeared. The official report said he died at home. But what if that wasn't true? What if whatever killed all those people back in 1978 had killed him too? I pulled out my phone and searched for the address. Parker Street was on the south side of Salem, in the old industrial district where most of the buildings had been abandoned for years. The textile mill had been closed since the early 80s. I remembered driving past it as a kid, this huge brick building with broken windows and graffiti on the walls. My grandmother had always told me to stay away from there, said it was dangerous. Now I understood why. I shoved all the reports back into the box except for my grandfather's note. That one I folded carefully and put in my jacket pocket. Then I headed for my car. Ramirez called while I was driving, asking where I was and what I was doing. I told him I was following a lead and hung up before he could ask more questions. I knew I should probably wait for backup, follow protocol, do this by the book, but something told me I needed to see that mill for myself. The drive took 20 minutes. The industrial district was mostly empty, just old warehouses and factory buildings that nobody used anymore. The textile mill was at the end of Parker Street, separated from the other buildings by an empty lot full of weeds and broken concrete. It was a massive 3-story brick building with most of its windows broken out. The front doors were chained shut, but I could see where someone had cut through the chain at some point. The cut ends were rusty, so it had been a while. I pushed through the doors and stepped inside. The smell hit me immediately, that thick metallic smell I'd noticed at the crime scenes. It was stronger here, so strong it made my eyes water. The main floor of the mill was one huge open space filled with old machinery covered in rust and cobwebs. I pulled out my flashlight and swept it across the room. The beam caught on old weaving machines and broken conveyor belts, everything coated in decades of dust. My footsteps echoed off the high ceiling as I walked deeper into the building. I kept my hand on my gun, even though I wasn't sure what good it would do against whatever I was looking for. In the far corner of the room, I noticed something that didn't belong. A pile of objects, maybe a dozen of them, arranged in a neat little cluster like someone had been collecting them. I walked over and crouched down to get a closer look. There was a vinyl record still in its sleeve, a pair of old sunglasses, a wristwatch with a cracked face, a keychain shaped like a tiny car, and several other things that all looked like they came from the 70s or 80s. They weren't covered in dust like everything else in the mill. Someone had been here recently and they'd left these things behind. Or maybe they were gathering them. Either way, it made my skin crawl. I stood up and kept searching. The mill had 3 floors, and I checked every single one. Most of the rooms were empty except for broken furniture and old equipment. But on the 3rd floor, in what looked like it used to be an office, I found something that made me stop dead in my tracks. There was writing on the wall, carved deep into the plaster with something sharp. The same symbols I'd seen at the crime scenes, dozens of them covering the entire wall. And beneath the symbols, someone had scratched words in English. It feeds on fear. It takes what scares you most and makes it real. Don't look at the objects. Don't touch them. If you see the circles, run. The handwriting looked like my grandfather's. I pulled out the note from my pocket and compared them. It was definitely his writing, shaky and desperate. He'd been here. He'd figured something out and written it down as a warning. But a warning for who? And why hadn't he just burned this place down like his note said to do? I heard something then. A faint scratching sound coming from somewhere above me. I froze, my hand instinctively going to my gun. The sound came again, louder this time, like nails dragging across wood. It was coming from the roof. I looked up at the ceiling and saw a hatch leading to the attic space above. The hatch was slightly open, just a crack, and I could see darkness beyond it. Every instinct I had told me to leave, to get out of that building and call for backup. But I thought about those 3 people who'd died, about their frozen screams and bulging eyes. I thought about my grandfather and what might have happened to him here. So instead of running, I dragged an old desk over to the wall, climbed up on it, and pushed the hatch open. The smell that came down was worse than anything I'd experienced so far. It was like rotting meat mixed with rust and something else I couldn't identify, something that made my stomach turn and my head spin. I pulled myself up into the attic and shined my flashlight around. The space was low and cramped, with exposed beams and insulation hanging down in strips. And there, in the far corner, I saw it. At first I thought it was a pile of old clothes or maybe a bundle of rags, but then it moved. It unfolded itself slowly, rising up until it was standing. It was about 5 feet tall, covered in what looked like a dark robe or cloak that hung down to the floor. I couldn't see its face because the hood was pulled up, but I could feel it looking at me. The air in the attic seemed to get colder, and that metallic smell got so strong I had to breathe through my mouth. The thing took a step toward me, and that's when I saw its hand emerge from under the robe. It wasn't a normal hand. The skin was gray and wrinkled like old paper, and there were too many fingers, all of them too long and bent at wrong angles. But what made me want to scream was what I saw on the palm. There was a mouth there, a small human mouth with lips and teeth, and it was opening and closing like it was trying to say something. I stumbled backward, nearly falling through the hatch. My flashlight beam swung wildly, and for just a second it caught the thing's face under the hood. I wish I could say I didn't see it clearly, that it was too dark, or I was too scared to register what I was looking at. But I saw it. God help me, I saw it. Its face was covered in eyes. Not 2 eyes, not even 3 or 4, but dozens of them, all different sizes, all blinking independently. And mixed in with the eyes were mouths, small ones like the mouth on its hand, all opening and closing in this horrible rhythm. The thing let out a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a sigh. It was a wet, rattling noise that came from all those mouths at once. Then it rushed toward me, moving faster than anything that size should be able to move. I did the only thing I could think of. I dropped through the hatch, landed hard on the desk below, and ran. I ran down 3 flights of stairs, through that main room with all the machinery, and out into the daylight. I didn't stop running until I was in my car with the doors locked and the engine started. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. I sat there for a long time, trying to convince myself that what I'd seen wasn't real, that it was just shadows and stress and lack of sleep playing tricks on my mind. But I knew better. That thing in the attic was real, and somehow it was connected to those deaths. I drove back to my apartment because I didn't know where else to go. I couldn't go to the station and tell Rodriguez I'd seen a monster covered in eyes and mouths. She'd think I'd lost my mind, and honestly, maybe I had. I parked in my usual spot and just sat there for a while, trying to process everything. The sun was setting now, painting the sky orange and red, and I realized I'd been awake for almost 24 hours straight. My whole body ached, and my head felt like it was stuffed with cotton. When I finally got out of the car and walked to my building, I noticed something that made me stop. My neighbor's apartment, the one where I'd found the first body this morning, had police tape across the door, but there was something sitting on the doormat. I walked closer, even though every part of me was screaming to stay away. It was a small wooden box, old and weathered, with brass hinges that were green with age. I didn't remember seeing it there this morning. I knew I shouldn't touch it. My grandfather's warning echoed in my head. Don't touch the objects. But I needed to understand what was happening. I pulled my sleeve down over my hand like a makeshift glove and picked up the box. It was heavier than it looked. I carried it into my apartment and set it on my kitchen table, then just stared at it for a long time. The box had a simple metal clasp holding it shut. I used a knife to flip the clasp open, then used the knife to lift the lid. Inside was a collection of old photographs, the kind with white borders and dates stamped on the back. I carefully dumped them out onto the table without touching them directly. The photos were all from the 70s based on the clothes and hairstyles. They showed different people, different places, different moments. A family at a beach, a couple at a wedding, a kid blowing out birthday candles. Normal, happy memories. But when I looked closer, I noticed something wrong with every single photo. In the background of each one, barely visible, was a dark shape. Sometimes it was in a doorway, sometimes behind a tree, sometimes just a shadow in the corner. But it was always there, watching. And in every photo, the people looked happy and unaware, not knowing they were being observed. I flipped one of the photos over. On the back, someone had written a date and a name. The date was from 1978. The name was one I recognized from the old case files, one of the victims who died that year. I checked the other photos. Every single one had a name and date on the back. Every single name was a victim from 1978. These were their photos, their memories. And that thing had been watching them long before they died. My phone rang, making me jump so badly I knocked one of the photos onto the floor. It was Ramirez. He was calling to tell me there had been another death. A man had been found in his car parked outside a grocery store. Same expression of terror, same cardiac arrest. And there was an old transistor radio sitting on the dashboard, placed right where the driver would see it. I told Ramirez I'd be there soon, but I hung up before he could ask me any questions. 4 deaths now, maybe 5 if you counted my grandfather. And those were just the ones I knew about. How many people had this thing killed over the years? How many times had it done this? My grandfather's note said it had been hunting in Salem longer than any of us had been alive. That could mean decades, centuries even. I looked at the photos spread across my table and suddenly understood. The objects weren't just random. They were connected to the victims somehow, tied to their memories or their fears. The creature was using them as bait, as a way to get close to people. But why? What did it want? I thought about what my grandfather had written on that wall in the mill. It feeds on fear. That was the key. This thing didn't just kill people. It fed on their terror. That's why the victims all had those expressions. Why they looked like they'd died in the middle of the worst moment of their lives. The creature was feeding on their fear like it was food. I needed to know more. I grabbed my laptop and started searching for any information about Jurupari. Most of what I found was about South American mythology, legends from indigenous tribes about a demon or spirit that punished people for their sins. But one article caught my attention. It described Jurupari as an entity that fed on human fear, that could take memories and twist them into nightmares. It said the entity would collect objects that held emotional significance and use them to trap its victims in their own worst fears. The article also mentioned that Jurupari could be bound or trapped, but only through specific rituals involving circles and symbols. The victims I'd found had tried to protect themselves with those circles, but it hadn't worked. Maybe they'd drawn the symbols wrong, or maybe they'd been too scared to complete the ritual. Or maybe the creature was just too strong. I looked at the photos again and noticed something else. In one of them, barely visible in the corner, I could see part of a building. I zoomed in on my phone and realized it was the textile mill. The photo was taken outside the mill, probably back when it was still operating, which meant the creature had been there for at least 40 years, maybe longer. My phone buzzed with a text from Ramirez. "Where are you?" "Captain wants you back at the station now." But I couldn't go back there yet. I had one more thing I needed to do. I needed to go back to that mill. I knew going back was probably the stupidest thing I could do, but I couldn't just sit around while more people died. My grandfather had tried to stop this thing 40 years ago, and whatever he'd done had worked for a while. The deaths had stopped after he disappeared. Maybe he'd figured out how to trap it, or bind it somehow, and maybe I could do the same thing. I grabbed a backpack and started filling it with anything I thought might help. My gun, extra ammunition, a flashlight, matches, lighter fluid. I didn't know if any of it would work against something like that creature, but I had to try. Before I left, I did one more thing. I took all those photographs from the wooden box and used my lighter to set them on fire in the kitchen sink. They burned quickly, curling up and turning to ash. I don't know why I did it, but it felt important, like I was taking something away from the creature. When the last photo had burned, I grabbed my backpack and headed out. The drive back to the mill felt longer this time. The sun had set completely, and the industrial district was pitch black except for a few streetlights that barely worked. I parked in the same spot as before and sat there for a minute, trying to build up my courage. I could still see that thing in my mind, all those eyes and mouths covering its body. But I thought about my neighbor, about the postal worker and the teacher, about all the people who died terrified and alone. Someone had to stop this. I got out of the car and walked to the mill. The front doors were still unlocked, and I pushed through them into the darkness. I turned on my flashlight and made my way to the stairs, climbing up to the 3rd floor where I'd seen the creature before. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Every shadow looked like it was moving, and every sound made me jump. When I reached the office with my grandfather's writing on the wall, I stopped and read it again. It feeds on fear. Don't look at the objects. Don't touch them. If you see the circles, run. But I couldn't run anymore. I had to face this thing. I climbed up onto the desk and pulled myself into the attic. The smell was even worse than before, that rotting metallic stench that made my eyes water. I swept my flashlight around and saw it immediately. The creature was standing in the same corner, its dark robe pooling around its feet. It turned toward me, and I saw all those eyes blink at once. My hand went to my gun, but before I could pull it out, the creature moved. It was impossibly fast, crossing the attic in seconds. It grabbed my wrist with that horrible hand, the one with the mouth in the palm, and I felt something sharp bite into my skin. I yelled and jerked away, falling backward onto the dusty floor. Blood was dripping from my wrist where the mouth had bitten me. The creature stood over me, and its robe fell open. Underneath, its entire body was covered in eyes and mouths, all of them moving independently, all of them looking at me. It made that wet rattling sound again, and suddenly I wasn't in the attic anymore. I was 8 years old, trapped in a closet. It was a memory I'd buried deep, something I never wanted to think about. My father had locked me in there as punishment for something I couldn't even remember now. I'd been in that closet for hours, screaming and crying, terrified of the dark and the small space. That fear was the worst thing I'd ever felt as a child, and now it was happening again. I could feel the walls pressing in, could smell the musty air, could hear myself screaming. But then I remembered something else from that memory. I remembered that eventually, my mother had found me and let me out. I remembered her hugging me and telling me I was safe. The fear had ended. I'd survived it. I opened my eyes, and I was back in the attic. The creature was still standing over me, but something was different. My blood was dripping onto the floor, and where it landed, the creature's robe was starting to smoke. It stepped back quickly, and I saw one of the eyes on its chest burst like a popped balloon, leaking thick black fluid. My grandfather's note hadn't mentioned blood, but suddenly I understood. The creature fed on fear, but blood was different. Blood was life, the opposite of the death and terror it thrived on. I grabbed a piece of broken wood from the floor and dragged it across my palm, opening a deep cut. Blood poured out, and I flung it at the creature. The blood hit its body, and the reaction was immediate. Everywhere the blood touched, the skin bubbled and burst, eyes popped, and mouth screamed. The creature stumbled backward, that rattling sound turning into something like a shriek. It tried to cover itself with the robe, but I kept coming, kept throwing blood at it. My hand was bleeding badly now, and I was getting lightheaded, but I couldn't stop. The creature backed into the corner, and I saw something I hadn't noticed before. There was an old metal furnace vent in the wall behind it, big enough for something to crawl through. The creature was trying to escape through it, squeezing its body into the opening. But I grabbed my lighter fluid and sprayed it across the creature's back, then threw my lighter. The flames caught instantly, spreading across its body. The creature's shriek became deafening. It thrashed and writhed, trying to put out the flames, but they spread too quickly. I watched as the eyes melted and the mouth stopped moving. The whole thing collapsed in on itself, turning to ash and smoke. The smell was unbearable, but I didn't look away. I watched until there was nothing left but black residue on the attic floor. I don't remember climbing down from the attic or leaving the mill. The next thing I knew, I was sitting in my car with my hand wrapped in my shirt, blood soaking through the fabric. I called Ramirez and told him to send crime scene techs to the mill, told him to collect all those vintage objects and burn them. He asked me 100 questions, but I just hung up. The death stopped after that night. No more terrified faces, no more mysterious cardiac arrests. The press moved on to other stories, and eventually people forgot about the fear killer. But I didn't forget. I still think about it sometimes, about that creature covered in eyes and mouths, about how it had been hunting in Salem for who knows how long. I think about my grandfather too, and wonder if he faced the same choice I did. Maybe he'd tried to stop it and failed, or maybe he'd succeeded in trapping it for a while, but knew it would eventually escape. Either way, he'd tried. And now, finally, it was over. I still live in the same apartment, and sometimes late at night, I think I hear that scratching sound from the mill. But when I check, there's never anything there. Just shadows and old memories and the faint smell of something metallic that might just be my imagination. I tell myself it's gone, that I killed it. But part of me wonders if something that old, that hungry, can ever really die. Part of me wonders if somewhere in Salem, in another abandoned building or dark corner, it's gathering new objects and waiting for its next victim. But for now, at least, the city is safe. And that has to be enough.